and Kaplan. I'm Kaplan Instructor Stephanie, and in this session, we're going to be talking about the GED RLA test, specifically how you can read strategically those texts that you'll encounter on test day. Let's take a look at your learning objectives for this lesson. So by the end of this session, you should be more comfortable identifying the premise or argument, as well as the supporting evidence of an author's argument. And we'll also talk about how to identify that argument itself. You'll also gain experience making inferences and drawing conclusions using the information that's provided either in the text or in the graph. You'll be able to look for the author's purpose or their point of view and see how these other elements of the text work with that purpose, so that is kind of like the unifying force behind the text. And finally, if you have more than one text or more than one source document, we'll be giving you some ways to synthesize, compare, and contrast that information. All right, so that's what's on our schedule for this lesson. Let's first talk about what the author's argument is. So an argument in this case is just a statement of position. It's not necessarily something negative or combative, but really this is just the author's point of view. This is the point the author is trying to make. Now, a properly constructed argument is going to have several different elements. First, it will have the claim. This in and of itself is the main crux of the argument. This is the point the author is making. This is the argument the author is presenting. Of course, if you just have a claim but you don't have anything to back it up, what you're really stating is your opinion. So for it to be an argument, you also have to have evidence. And this is the support that the author is using to back up his or her claim. And finally, most arguments have a premise. This is sort of the unstated assumption. This is something that must be true in order for the argument to be logical. And we'll see several of these premises as we work through some sample text today. So all three of these components need to be there in order for the author to have a properly constructed argument. Now, in some passages, the author may use really explicit terms to clue you into either their claim or their evidence. For instance, if the author says something like "for these reasons" or "it follows that," then you can see that this is going to introduce their conclusion. Therefore, here's the point I'm trying to make. In other cases, the author might not use such explicit statements, so you'll have to work with the text in its entire context in order to piece together what is the point the author is making with the evidence that he or she also presents to you. Now, like I said, sometimes these conclusion or claim statements are going to have some really explicit statements that allow you to identify them right away. Again, these are going to be those statements that the author makes that presents his or her perspective or his or her point of view. So let's look at this sample text right here. We'll use this to identify several different elements of an argument. What I want you to do right now is take a moment to read the text. And if you need some more time, you can always go ahead and just pause this video and identify what is the author's argument. What is the author's position or point of view on these anti-texting laws? You might be able to summarize the author's argument as saying, well, the author thinks that these are a good idea. Now, the text itself that may have clued you into this is right here. These laws are clearly a good decision. So here's where the author is stating an opinion, stating a position. And of course, you see the author also includes some other components of the argument as well, which we're going to talk about in just a second. In fact, let's do that right now. Now, like I said, if you just have a claim without anything to back it up, what you're really stating is your opinion. If I just said, well, these driving laws are a good idea, then I'm just giving you my opinion. But if I say these driving laws are a good idea, and here is why I think that, now what I'm presenting you with is an argument. And the reasons to believe a claim, those are called the pieces of evidence. Now, evidence can be facts, it can be a statistic, it can just be an explanation or a reason, but it's anything that an author uses in order to convince the reader that his or her claim should be believed. So you can think of this as the support for the argument. Now we're going to go back to this same text. We already know what the author's claim is, right? These laws are a good idea or a good decision. So what evidence does the author use to support his or her claim? Take a look and identify it in the text. In this case, the author provides you with some statistics. The author says, well, here's a statistic that drivers are more likely to have accidents while texting than when they're not. So by using these statistics, that is the reason or the rationale that the author is given in order to support his or her claim that these laws are a good idea. Now, just because an author presents evidence doesn't necessarily mean that it's valid. And certainly, I'm sure we can all think of examples in our own life when someone has told us something and given us their reason and we don't agree. We say, well, that's not a good enough reason, or that reason is flawed, or here's why that reason has some sort of inherent flaw. So just because an author has made a claim and given evidence doesn't necessarily mean that they have a well-constructed argument. For an argument to be valid, the information that is being provided as evidence needs to be relevant and also needs to be provable. It needs to be something that comes from a reliable source. So be cautious of evidence that relies on emotion, that instead of providing some sort of kind of objectivity or facts, appeals to fear or pity or some sort of emotional appeal. Be wary of arguments that just rely on popular opinion. Well, if everybody likes it, it must be good. Well, not necessarily, right? Certainly, maybe just a lot of people like something that that you find to have a flaw. So popular opinion or appeals to popular opinion don't necessarily make for good evidence. And finally, make sure that the author isn't confusing two related factors as cause and effect. Just because two things happen to happen at the same time doesn't mean that one necessarily creates the cause of the other. There's kind of the classic example that, as ice cream sales go up, the murder rate goes up. Well, it doesn't mean that if you stop buying ice cream, the murder rate's going to go down, because we all know that it's, perfectly fine to go buy ice cream and, not accidentally take a life in the process. So what's happening then is there's some other related factor. In this case, they tend to think that it has to do with, well, we buy more ice cream when the weather is nice. People apparently just go outside and commit more crimes when the weather is nice as well. But it has nothing to do with those two things causing each other. They just happen to be correlated by some other third variable. So make sure that you don't confuse cause and effect. Now, here are some of those different types of evidence. And so remember, some authors might include misleading evidence in order to support their claim if they don't have good enough valid evidence for their position to begin with. So anytime you see these types of evidence, make sure you're asking yourself the appropriate question. If you're presented with a fact, ask yourself, is this the complete picture? Or am I only getting a really narrow view of like a cherry-picked fact out of context? If you're given data or statistics, how was this information gathered? Right? Is this using good statistics? Is this a random sampling? Or, is the population that this data was coming from, was it already biased to begin with? Are these numbers, do they accurately represent the type of information that the author is trying to provide support for? If you're given examples and anecdotes, well, are they true or are they even relevant? Sometimes it might just be a feel-good story that really has nothing to do with the kind of argument itself. Appeals to authority. Well, is this person an authority on this particular instance? We can all think of things that we might be authorities on, but not in other cases. And just like appealing to people in positions of authority elsewhere. For instance, if we wanted to ask a celebrity for advice on marketing, I'm sure that celebrity would be a fantastic source, particularly if this is a celebrity that's done a lot of their own marketing. They're going to have a lot of experience in that. But maybe a celebrity is not the best person to ask about, say, I don't know, foreign affairs, something that they might not have experience in directly. So is this person an authority on the issue in question, or are they just an authority in some other realm? And finally, is this person well-known within their field of expertise? Is this person a doctor that's well-known and thought to be reliable and credible, or is this a person who is maybe a doctor in name only, or just, that one dentist they found that disagreed with 9 out of 10, right? So who are the authorities that are being referenced? And finally, we talked already about causality. Is one thing really causing the other, or they are just both maybe happening at the same time for some sort of unrelated reason? So all sorts of questions in order to identify valid evidence. And on test day, you will be asked about the strength of evidence, which is to say, which of these pieces of evidence presented may be stronger, or what is a reason that the evidence was weak, etc. Now, the third part of an argument is the premise. And the premise is something that the author believes to be true. If the author didn't think that this was true, then their argument would fall apart. There would be absolutely no reason to have that argument to begin with. Now, sometimes these are also called assumptions. So if you're asked to identify an assumption, what you're being asked is to identify a premise, or you're being asked to kind of identify something that is unstated but links together the author's thought processes. So we're back to this example that we had earlier. Now, we already know that the author thinks these driving laws are a good idea, and we also know why the author thinks these laws are a good idea. The author thinks these laws are good because drivers have more accidents when they're texting. So what are some of the unstated assumptions, or what is the premise of this author's argument? What must be true in order for it to be reasonable to say, well, laws that prevent accidents are a good idea? How would you state this in your own words? Well, one way to state this is that the author assumes it's the responsibility of the government to ensure safety of its citizens. In fact, the author says right here, it's common sense that the government has a responsibility to protect its citizens. So in order for the author to say, well, laws that prevent accidents are a good thing, the author must assume that it is the government's role to pass laws that encourage safety or that ensure safety of people on the road. If the author didn't think that, if the author didn't think that it was the government's role to do that, then the entire argument of these laws being a good idea, and here's why, completely falls apart. There's no foundation for that line of reasoning at all. Now we're going to do two different practice sets in this lesson, and here's the first one right now. For this first one, we'll go ahead and work through this one paragraph by paragraph. So what I want you to do is pause the video, and with each paragraph, I want you to identify the elements of the argument. Do you see a claim? Do you see evidence? Do you see a premise? And when you do, that is what you're going to write down as part of your passage map. So in this first paragraph, I want you to identify the author's claim, as well as the evidence that the author uses to support that claim. Go ahead and pause the video and unpause once you've identified those two components of this first paragraph. Oh, we've got a really strong keyword right in that first sentence that indicates what this author's claim is. Anytime you see an author using the word should is a keyword that indicates this is my opinion, or this is what the author believes. So the author believes that these mercury amalgam fillings should be banned. And that is their claim. That is the point of view of this author. Ban mercury fillings. And then the author also includes some evidence. What is the reason that this author believes this? Well, the author says a couple of things. The author says this causes some health problems. So that's one component of evidence. And then the author cites a study. So a study reported, and we have a little bit more evidence about these particular health problems. All right, now that you've identified the author's point of view as well as the evidence in paragraph 1, go ahead and do the same thing now with paragraph 2. Does the author make an additional claim, or is the author providing more evidence for a claim that's been earlier stated? What is happening in paragraph 2? What are the elements of the argument that you can identify? Pause the video, take a look, and unpause when you're ready to continue. Well, we have another keyword clue here, in addition. So this is going to provide more evidence for why this should be banned. So in addition to the reasons in the first paragraph, which were the health consequences, here the author says, well, they're also bad for the environment. So here's another reason that it should be banned. Bad for the environment. All right, and now we have an example. This is the specific evidence that the author uses to illustrate why they're bad for the environment. You know what's coming next. We're going to continue to break this down with paragraph 3. So once more, go ahead and pause the video and identify the evidence, the claims that the author is making to support his or her viewpoint here in paragraph 3. Then we'll analyze it together once you unpause. What we see taking place in paragraph 3 is another point of view. There's that keyword again, should. So because of the health problems, because of the environmental problems, this author claims that these dental fillings should be replaced. So here's an alternative to the mercury fillings. And then the author provides evidence for that claim. The author says, well, they're popular, so banning them, no one will care. Right? There's just no objection to changing because they are already popular. So now that you have passage mapped all 3 paragraphs of this first passage, let's go ahead and look at those questions. So again, this author's claim here is to ban mercury fillings, right? There's no reason not to, right? There's just a bunch of reasons that they're bad, right? Bad for the environment, bad for the health, no reason not to switch to this alternative. Okay, now when you are asked, dealing with questions that ask about the main argument, remember to use your passage map. So over here you see, here are those notes that we took from each of those paragraphs. You will have those kind of written down for you on test day. So you want to make sure that as you practice here, you're taking good, clear notes on that piece of paper or on your whiteboard so that you have this to refer back to once you reach the questions. So what is the main argument of passage 1? Well, again, the main argument is the author's overall point. So what was the overall point? What was this author claiming? And if you predicted something like, well, the author claims that we should ban mercury fillings or that mercury fillings are bad, you're absolutely right. This author does indeed claim that mercury amalgam fillings should be banned, and for these exact reasons. They're unhealthy, they've got the health problems, and they're bad for the environment. That was also what we saw there in paragraph 2. So answer choice C matches up very nicely with this particular passage map. Now answer choice A, this is the opposite of what this author says. The author says that they're not unhealthy. Well, that's false, right? The author says, in fact, they are quite unhealthy. Resin composites should replace mercury amalgam. The author does say that, but that's not the main point here, right? The main point is ban the mercury fillings because they're bad for the environment, and because there is an alternative. So in fact, the fact that there is an alternative, that these resin composites are already there, is more evidence for why the banning can take place without any consequences. Let's look at another question. This is question number 2. Now, question number 2 is asking about an assumption that the author makes about the consumers. So to answer question number 2, you'll have to go back to paragraph 3, where the author states banning mercury amalgam will create no consumer backlash. So in order for this statement to be true, in order for the author to believe this statement, what must he or she assume? Look at that in context. These are already popular, so banning will create no consumer backlash. What does the author assume? Well, notice here that the author says, well, they're popular because of their cosmetic appeal. So people like them because of the way they look, and therefore there will not be any backlash if we ban the mercury fillings. Well, the author assumes that the only thing that consumers care about is how they look and nothing else. So one of the assumptions the author makes here is that consumers have no other reason to pick a mercury filling over a composite filling, cost or durability. So this is an assumption. Remember, an assumption is something that is unstated, but that must be true in order for the author's thought process to be logical and to make sense. Now, this is just one part of a sample paired passage that we're going to look at in this lesson. And on the GED test, you will be presented with a set of paired passages. That means 2 passages that are somewhat related and that share a set of questions. And these passages are going to be related either by theme or by topic. They will have something in common. So in addition to being asked about each passage separately, you'll also get questions that ask you to synthesize the two passages together. How do they compare? How do they differ? How might one author think about something stated in a different passage? So when you're dealing with this paired passage set, determine what both passages have in common. What would both authors agree on? And what do the authors most strongly disagree on? And if you're taking good passage mapping notes, if you're focusing on the argument of each author, what is their point of view? What evidence do they use? What are their opinions? You will in fact be able to clearly see what they agree on and what they disagree on, because that information will be part of their argument. So to strategically read these passages, you want to be thinking about how one argument strengthens, weakens, agrees, or disagrees with the other argument that you're presented with in this paired passage set. Now, not all questions of the paired passage set are going to ask about both passages. Like I said, you're going to get questions that just ask about one passage or the other. So to keep these straight between two passages, here is your strategic reading paired passage strategy. Read the first passage and then answer questions that are just about the first passage. In fact, that's just what we did. We read a passage about one author's opinion on mercury fillings, and then we answered questions that were just about that first passage. Notice how when we did that passage, you had no idea that a second passage was coming, and so any of those wrong answer choices, you would have had no reason to assume that it was the opinion of a different author, right? We just treated it like a normal reading text. And then you do the exact same thing. You'll read the second passage and answer questions that just ask you about the second passage. And now at this point, you will have in fact answered most of those questions, but there'll be a few remaining, and then you'll go and analyze the questions that ask you about both passages. By breaking it up this way, by dividing and conquering, you're going to do two things. One, you're going to be able to address the questions right after you read that information. So you're going to be more accurate on most of those questions because you won't be confusing it with the other passage. And second, by treating them separately and by focusing on one and then focusing on the other, you're also going to be able to better solidify, okay, which information, which opinion goes with this passage, so that when you get to these questions that ask you about both, you will be less likely to confuse the two authors or the two perspectives. Again, like I said, when you're passage mapping, look at the author's argument, look at the author's point of view. That is going to be the main part of the text that these questions will ask you about. Now, these texts are related by topic or theme. They may have different purposes, they may have different tones, they may even have different formats, but they'll have some element in common. So let's look at two related texts right now. First, you can see we have a news story. So I'll go ahead and give you a moment to read through this short news clip. And now you might have a related text, which is an op-ed. And again, I'll go ahead and give you a moment to read through this shortened op-ed text. So what did both of these texts have in common? What is their related topic or theme? And if you're saying, well, both of these are talking about these new guidelines in school meals, notice how they're going about it somewhat differently, right? The news story is reporting on what it is. The op-ed is taking a particular opinion or particular judgment about them, but they're both talking about these new guidelines in just different ways. Now, you may also encounter a paired passage that contains an opposing argument. And this is where one author takes a position, say, for something, and another author takes an argument against something. That's another way that you may see two texts related. Now, these authors are going to reach different conclusions because they cite different evidence, or they may use the same evidence but have different underlying assumptions. So that's what you want to be paying attention to when you see opposing arguments. All right, so let's look at a sample of that right now. So here's author one. I want you to pause the video so that you have time to read author one and identify what is author one's point of view. What is the conclusion that author one is going to reach? Well, author one makes a very declarative stance right up front. The author says this will reduce coal's environmental impact. So author one is focusing on the environmental impact of burning coal, saying that this clean coal technology will reduce the environmental impact, and then provides some reasons why, that these new technologies have this and that effect, which will support this particular claim. Now let's look at author two. What is author two focusing on? Does author two take a completely opposing position? Is it slightly opposing? Is it just about the same general topic but a different angle? What is author two's point of view? Well, author two says this is just an advertising slogan. Author two is also looking at the environmental impact, so that's something that they have in common. But author two says, well, the hazards start well before these new technologies are even employed. So author two is also focusing on the environmental impacts, but prior to burning. And you can see here that each of these authors take an opposing stance on clean coal technology. Author one saying clean coal, great, is going to reduce the environmental impact. Author two saying clean coal is just advertising. It's not going to do anything to the environment because it all starts well before that. So this is an example of how these two could be opposing. Now, in our example that we worked out, we already saw one author's perspective on mercury amalgam fillings. Let's take a look at the other author here, and you can assess for yourself, is this author taking an entirely opposing point of view, or are these texts just related by topic? Let's find out. I want you to pause the video and I want you to read and identify this first paragraph, identifying the author's main claim, again, that important key element of the argument, as well as any evidence that the author uses to support his or her claim. Take a look in this first paragraph. Author one here says, well, the environmental impact is serious. However, the health effects are not. So this is author two's point of view. When it comes to mercury in the environment, mercury environmental problems, real. But this health problem associated with the fillings, not so much. All right, let's continue reading. Go ahead and read paragraph 2. What further evidence does the author use to support his or her claims? Well, the author says, well, it's known people absorb a small amount. However, the author says most of this doesn't stay in the body. So here is some evidence. People absorb small amounts, but it's not significant. Most of this is excreted. And in fact, the author says there's no study. So in fact, the author two's evidence is that there's a lack of evidence for the other position. So author two says there's just no evidence for the other point of view. Now Arthur makes another claim. Because these fillings last longer, this is preferable whenever there's no cosmetic reason. So now the author is providing evidence to support his or her claim here, which is that mercury amalgam fillings are safe. There's no health reason not to have them, especially if there is no cosmetic reason to have something else. Now, the author makes another claim in paragraph 3. So as you read paragraph 3, take a look. What new perspectives does this author introduce in paragraph 3, and what evidence does he or she use to support that particular claim? Well, our author up to this point has spent a lot of time talking about here's some evidence why the health impacts are minimal. And now the author shifts to focus on why the environmental impacts are real and cannot be ignored. In fact, the author uses this very strong word, must. So must is even stronger than should. If an author uses the word should, you're definitely paying attention because that introduces his or her opinion. If the author uses the word like must, same thing. Right? If it must happen, the author definitely feels strongly about this. The author is saying it must be regulated and then provides some evidence from the EPA. So here's that statistic. The EPA says that this ends up in wastewater. All right, so we don't want to necessarily pay attention to what the statistic is, but it is important to note, okay, this is evidence, and this is evidence from a source of authority. Right? The EPA would definitely be an authority on environment. So we do have a statistic. We've asked ourselves, is this coming from a reliable source? And yes, it is. Okay. Now the author has more of, kind of elaborates on this a little bit, and there's that word again. Okay, mercury amalgam should remain available because, here's the reason, but every dental office must have a way to remove this. So this is the author's conclusion. Mercury amalgam, it's safe. Keep it. Here's the reason it's good, more durable than these others, but the environmental problems are real, so every dental office should have a way to address that. All right, on to some questions that just ask you about passage 2, following that strategy for strategic reading. So which statement best describes the supporting evidence in paragraph 3 of passage 2? Well, I've pulled paragraph 3 up here for you to take a look at. Review the evidence that was presented and match your answer up. Looking back from your notes, you know that this included that statistic from the EPA. So there it is. So what type of evidence is this? Well, it's a statistic, and it's a statistic from an authoritative source. And this matches up with answer choice D. It's a convincing statistic, and it's convincing because it comes from a reliable source. And that's what makes it, in fact, convincing. Now let's look at those questions that ask you to synthesize both passage 1 from earlier and passage 2 that we just looked at. So what was the focus of both passages? Well, what did both of these have in common? What was that common topic or theme that they both discussed? Absolutely, they both focused on this mercury dental amalgam. Author 1 said ban it completely. Author 2 said it's not really a problem, but you should definitely find ways to prevent it from impacting the environment. So they were both talking about these mercury fillings. Now, here's a question that asks you what one writer would agree with. So the writer of passage 2 would agree with which of the following statements? This is asking you to make an inference. So we know that the author of passage 2 said, well, the health consequences are somewhat small, but the environmental impact is real. Let's look back over these answer choices. And if you need to flip back through the text to find support for your answer choice, go ahead and do so. But pause the video, take as much time as you need to answer question number 5. Author 2's point of view. Well, we know it's not going to align with answer choice A. This is in fact author 1's point of view. Author 2 doesn't say that mercury amalgam film should be banned. That's the other passage. Notice how some of these wrong answer choices are going to come from the other text. We don't want what author 1 says, we want what author 2 says. Okay, so now that we've eliminated that answer, which of these do we have support for in the text? Well, the author says that mercury fillings are in fact preferable in certain cases. Because they last longer, they're preferable than these resins, except when there is cosmetic need. So based on this, author 2 would likely agree with the fact that these resin composite fillings look better, particularly when they're on a visible tooth surface. And that's because the author says that's the reason to use an amalgam, to use a resin composite amalgam. So these composite fillings are best when there is a cosmetic need. So a cosmetic need would arise if it was going to be seen on a visible tooth. Now, answer choice C is also the opposite, right? The author says that this contamination is a very important issue. That's why there must be regulation to avoid it. And all is another very extreme word. The author doesn't say that these resin composite fillings are preferable in all cases. In fact, the author says the mercury fillings are preferable in many cases, except for when there's a cosmetic need to fix it. And that is why we can have some good strong proof for answer choice B. Now, which of the passages has weaker supporting evidence and why? Well, I've gone ahead and put the evidence, some of the evidence that we found from both of these passages, up on the board. Which of these is weaker and why? Match that up with an answer choice and then we'll review. Well, both authors cite some sort of study. Passage 1 just says a study and then gives some information, whereas passage 2 presents a study from the EPA. So which of those is weaker? Well, which are you more likely to believe? Someone who can cite an authoritative source, or someone just says, well, I read this one thing this one time in a study? Certainly, it's going to be the one that comes from the reputable source that is considered to be more valid. So the weaker evidence is going to come from passage 1. This study is not sourced. We have no idea where the author got this information from the study or the statistics. So that is why this is the weaker evidence. Remember, just because an author presents evidence doesn't necessarily mean it's good, valid evidence. Always be questioning the validity of the source using some of those questions that we mentioned there in that kind of review table that you have there in the PDF. And finally, here's our last question for this paired passage set. Which of the statements in passage 1 is an example of faulty reasoning? Again, just because the author has evidence doesn't necessarily mean it's valid. What is the flaw? All right, I'm going to give you a moment to pause the video here and to look back over this text. If you need to, feel free to use that reference page of those questions you should be asking yourself when presented with evidence. Match it up with an answer choice, and then we will discuss it. All right, so an example of faulty reasoning. Well, let's look at some of these. So the author says that these composites are becoming popular. Well, this is information that's been provided to us. We don't have any reason to disbelieve this. The author has some data. They're becoming popular for this reason due to their cosmetic appeal. So this is data that's provided in the text, and there's no flaw here. Now let's look at answer choice B. The use of dental amalgam has already been banned in several European nations. Well, if we go back, the author does state this. This is a fact, and a fact can definitely be fact-checked. So there's no line of faulty reasoning here because this is just the presentation of a fact. The mercury released from dental amalgam has damaging environmental consequences. Well, this right here is stated, right? The author has some good reasons for this. There's some damaging environmental consequences. It goes directly into sewage. It can be leached into things. So here we have a cause and effect. Wastewater produced goes into these areas. This area gets into the land, groundwater. This groundwater with the mercury has damaging consequences. You can see a clear cause and effect relationship here. But let's look at answer choice D. The mercury that accumulates in the body tissues causes the health problems. And we've got this word causes. Causes is always going to be kind of one of those words to investigate because you want to make sure that what the author is stating actually can be proven from start to finish and that there's not just two things that may be related. Let's look at how the author presents this evidence in the text. Well, the author says some of this mercury is leached out and it's swallowed, and then a little bit of it is absorbed into the tissues. And then the study reports that patients with a higher number of fillings have higher rates of these other occurrences. So the question to ask is, are they sure it's the fillings that are causing this? If you can think of some other reason why people that have more fillings may also have higher rates of these other diseases, what you have found is good evidence for why this line of thought process isn't accurate. This is a line of faulty reasoning. The author is correlating two potentially associated things, but something that's not been proven. There's no proof that links the mercury to these other health problems. The author is saying, well, these people have more fillings. Those same people also have more health problems. I guess it must be the fillings that cause it, but there isn't any proof for that. So that's the line of faulty reasoning in passage number 1. All right. Hopefully you're feeling a little bit more confident and comfortable knowing what to look for as you break down these passages. So in fact, I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that right now on your own with this mixed practice passage. So you have 2 passages. We're going to break it up. We're going to follow that method for strategic reasoning. So we're going to read, I'll have you read the first passage map the author's argument. What is the claim? What are the conclusions? What are the pieces of evidence that the author uses? And then we'll look at questions that are just about passage 1. All right, so go ahead and pause the video, take as much time as you need to do a thorough analysis, breaking down that argument for this first passage. You've got this picture right here, as well as some text right there. Take a look. And so Article 1 starts with this picture of both Roosevelt and Truman. And we see here, based on the title, that this is a summary of Truman's 1947 speech. Okay. So what did you identify as the primary argument of Truman's speech? What was the point of view? So here in this first paragraph, they give you a sense of what's happening. So here Truman is addressing the NAACP. You can see here that it says Truman described his efforts and his hopes for the future. All right, so here we go. Now we're going to learn what exactly that means. And in the second paragraph, Truman makes his claim. He makes an assertion right here. So here's another word that's indicating that you've got some sort of claim statement. Americans should repair these racial schisms that are taking place. And he continues with the fact that the government should, there's that word again, should protect and provide for all its people. Americans should possess decent homes, healthcare, etc. So there's the claim that America is ready to do this and that the government should protect all of its citizens. Now we got to contrast. It says, well, Truman didn't just provide a one-sided view, though. There are, in fact, quite a few issues. So here's some evidence for why this needs to be addressed. The author points out that some of the reasons that Truman brings this up is to show that, well, here are some reasons for needing to repair this schism that is being talked about. Okay. Now the author says, well, here's more evidence. So then Truman points out the administrative efforts. So we've got the reason. I'm here to talk to you about the racial systems we need to repair. America's ready. There have been some problems, so that's why it needs to be fixed. Here's some of the efforts that my administration is doing in order to try to repair these. And then we've got another piece of evidence here. This is that adoption of authority, or that appeal to authority. Truman cites the United Nations. Truman also cites the First Lady, or former First Lady here. Finally, Truman concludes the speech by quoting another authority figure, calling for a united nation. All right, so let's look at some of these questions now that ask just about Truman's argument. So why does Truman mention the United Nations Commission on Human Rights? This is to show what? If we go back to the context of where this has been cited, this is in the paragraph describing the administration's efforts to kind of bring the nation together. And the author says, well, he points out several examples being evidence of the administration's efforts to make improvements, including, there it is, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. So this is evidence to support Truman's claim that he supports civil rights for the United States, both internally as well as abroad. Now we've got the second passage here in this paired passage set. Again, I'm going to give you enough time, pause the video so you take as much time as you need to break down the argument that's here in Article 2. Keep in mind how these two are similar. So what is the uniting theme between Article 1 and Article 2? How do these two differ? And well as what are some of their similarities? And after we do that, we'll take a look at some questions that ask both about Article 2 as well as both articles together. Go ahead, pause the video and unpause when you're ready to continue. Well, this is Eleanor Roosevelt's speech. So we have one from Truman, and now we have one from Eleanor Roosevelt a year later on human rights. So you may already be seeing, well, both of these passages are related in that they both mentioned this particular speech, and they're both about rights of groups of people. So this is Eleanor Roosevelt's speech. That's what we see here in paragraph 6, kind of an introduction to where this is taking place. And here's her claim. So she is informing the audience of her purpose. Her purpose, therefore, being the main point. What is her point of view? What is her reason for giving this speech? And she says it is about preservation of human freedom. Okay, so we know that Eleanor Roosevelt claims that preservation of human freedom is important. Now, what are some of the components of this? What is evidence? And she says, well, there's two components of this. One is that, so here's our first one, basic rights are given to any individual. And the second is that it's unfinished, but that this is going to be presented to every nation. So she says, here's our two components of this international bill, and here's the intention of this bill. So this bill would be used as, so this is the reason for this bill. It will be used as a reference to shape national laws. Right, so we know what she's talking about, we know why she's talking, and we know the reason that she's talking about this particular bill. Okay. Now, we've got some additional information about this here. So here's the intention. It's going to be used as a reference. However, we've got a contrast. In reality, it hasn't been ratified by each nation. In this case, we have a contrast. 4 nations, including the Soviet Union, have abstained from this. So this is anecdotal evidence. This is kind of a story or an anecdote that is providing evidence for a particular component of the argument. In this case, this is showing some of those difficulties. So this is anecdotal evidence about the difficulties of getting this ratified. And now you have another specific example. Here's an example used about the media, drawing a specific example between the Soviet use of media and the American use of media. And here is, again, more of that. So while the US government did not punish, the USSR would. And so the premise here is that the USSR does punish political expressions while the US doesn't. All of this is evidence for the claim that it is, in fact, difficult to get some global understanding of what these human rights are or should be in this 2-part bill. Now, she concludes her speech by repeating her call to action. Remember, a call to action is going to be what the author wants to happen after you read this or after you listen to this. So this is, again, going to be part of that main point of view or that main conclusion. So this call to action is encouraging everyone to approve it. So she's saying, approve this bill. And again, that goes back to the claim that we saw earlier, which is approve this bill because the preservation of human freedom is important. Notice how all of that is support for kind of the same general concept. All right, let's look at some questions now that are just about passage 2. So what approach did she take, or what evidence did she present? What types of evidence did Eleanor Roosevelt use in this speech to encourage people to accept this and to approve it? Well, she provided some anecdotal evidence, and she also provided some examples. And those examples were on this particular issue. She described the difficulties in deciding upon universal definitions. And then we have that anecdotal evidence about the USSR and the US, and we have the example with the media. Right. So her approach here is to acknowledge the difficulties of convincing different nations to agree on common ideas. So that is there clearly illustrated in the text. So let's look at some of these other answer choices. She suggested that nations in a disagreement be removed. Nope, we don't see that anywhere in the text. She never said you should be removed or this nation should be removed. Warned of problems that would occur if. We don't have any hypotheticals here. Now, we may believe that problems would arise or will arise, but Roosevelt doesn't mention these directly in this article. So we don't know about what's going to happen if it's not passed. She's just saying you need to approve it. And compared abstaining nations with the voting nations. In fact, what she compares are two of those abstaining nations. And beyond that, the differences were insignificant. She's in fact saying that the differences were quite significant, and that's leading to some of those difficulties. All right, we've got one last question here that's asking you to compare the two passages. This is a drag and drop, ordering the sentences in both the order that they appeared within the passages and also attributing them to the correct passage. So I'll go ahead and pause the video, giving you a second to look back at the text and reorder these correctly, then unpause and we will review. And so there's two ways you can approach this particular drag and drop. Either way, you want to be looking one sentence at a time. You can either look back through each individual text and see which sentence comes first, or you can select a sentence and then figure out which one that is and which order it appears in. Let's, in this case, just take a look at Truman's speech and see which of these concepts is mentioned and in which order. So if we go back to Truman's speech, right in the beginning, Truman urges Americans to work together, to come together to repair these racial schisms. So if we take a look at the options that we have here, that is matching up with America should remain united. So despite these things, America should come together. Now, what else does Truman say here in the speech? Well, Truman is the one who mentions those racial tensions. And in fact, we can see this again in that text. If we go back, we can see that Truman did not paint a one-sided picture, right? He mentioned that there were issues within the nation. There were some racially motivated problems, and this is then going to match up with that sentence that racial tensions, in fact, that they exist, is a reason in itself to promote this positive change. Now, at this point, you know that these last two are going to be attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt's speech, but just in case, let's go back and make sure that we put them in the right order. So the International Bill of Rights should be used to shape laws, or all nations should adhere to the principles of protecting human freedoms. Let's see which comes first. All right, here is where she says that this should be presented to every nation, and we have the ratification of all of those right here. So the International Bill of Rights, it should be used to shape the laws, and then she mentions all nations should in fact use this in order to come up with a universal understanding of human rights. All right, now that you've completed this lesson, you should be more comfortable identifying the premise, the assumption, the evidence, as well as the claim of an argument, all four of those elements of an argument. We've also looked at how to draw some inferences from when things are not explicitly stated in the text. And often this comes from identifying the author's purpose and point of view. And finally, you did all of this in the context of synthesizing two related texts. As always, if you have further questions, reach out to us at gedhelp@kaplan.com. You know that effort and practice are keys to your GED test day success. So continue to reinforce these topics by completing additional practice questions and reaching out with any questions that you have. Good luck as you continue to prep for the test, and happy studying.